My apartment is located on the second floor of a building in a secluded area of the city. I work in the building opposite my home, on the other side of the road, so I usually walk there. I've been living in this area for a whole 5 years now, inheriting the apartment from my ancestors, who were well-off people and moved to a more comfortable neighborhood. They decided that I had grown up enough and became independent, so they handed over the old apartment to me under the condition that I wouldn't cause trouble, which I haven't. To be honest, I don't really complain. It's a decent one-room apartment in a quiet area with good neighbors. What more do you need for happiness? It's worth noting that to get to work, I have to constantly take the same route, turn left from the entrance and go around the corner of the building, always turning left since the building is L-shaped. Going around it on the right is not an option, then straight ahead to the road on the opposite side of the building, and the desired building is located right there. This information sets the stage for what happened next. Over the years of living in that building, I developed bad habits after a tiring workday. I sometimes felt bored and would peer into the windows of the first floor. The windows were quite low, and even from a distance, I could see what was happening with the residents. Usually, there was nothing particularly interesting, mostly living rooms or kitchens, so I never saw anything overly revealing there. But it was still interesting to watch people going about their business, like kind neighbor Lydia Kovalyova frying pancakes in her kitchen, seasoning them with butter from the local grocery store, or Uncle Goshu watching another football match on TV in his room, or a black cat with orange eyes sitting on the windowsill of a pretty girl's window, staring at me. It was a harmful habit but quite entertaining, especially after a hectic day at work. However, a little over 2 weeks ago, something happened that made me afraid to look into other people's windows, and that's what I'll tell you about today. It was early May when I finally received my paycheck and happily headed home. At home, I started counting my hard-earned money when suddenly I heard the sound of a running engine. I looked out the window and noticed two people by a familiar Ford downstairs. My neighbor Lydia Kovalyova and her husband were loading things into the trunk of their own car, apparently getting ready for a vacation. Yes, I think during our last conversation, she mentioned their imminent departure for 1 to 2 weeks, after which they needed to return apparently. A niece was soon to be born in their family. Where they were going, she didn't say, but she mentioned it was quite beautiful there. It seemed they were about to leave that day, since they were preparing so urgently. When they finished packing, they left their parking spot and drove towards the main road. I finished counting all my money, did a few chores, and went to bed. The next 8 days flew by like the wind before the scheduled inspection by the management. The whole team had to complete a ton of work within tight deadlines, making it extremely difficult to keep track of time. I woke up to my alarm at 6 in the morning just to gulp down coffee with hastily cooked porridge, rushed to the building opposite my home, grabbed some cookies from the cafeteria, rode the elevator up 6 floors, and collapsed into my office, tapping away at the keys from 7 in the morning until 9 in the evening, and only then, semi-dead and exhausted, did I stagger back home, where a delicious dinner and warm bed awaited me. And 7 to 8 hours later, it all started again. Work had turned into some kind of nightmare. Wherever you looked, everyone was rushing somewhere, either with documents for legal agreements, paper for the printer, or simply to the bathroom for their own needs. But thank goodness it all ended on a good note, and I didn't have to worry anymore, because all the contracts were signed, no one was fired, and the whole team finally breathed a sigh of relief. And it was after that day that things began. To be more specific, it was a Tuesday. I was returning home from work, as usual, tired but not as much as during those past 8 days of madness. I crossed the road, approached the windows on the second floor, and out of habit, started peering into the familiar rooms. Everything was as usual. Nothing particularly new. I saw a guy from the neighboring entrance sitting at a table writing some essay on his laptop, and the black cat belonging to the girl next door was on the windowsill, staring at me as if trying to tell me something. I smiled at it and continued towards the entrance, and then my eyes caught a strange detail that I didn't immediately pay attention to. One of the windows was lit, and in its dim, yellowish light, I could make out the outlines of Lydia's kitchen. This struck me as quite strange. Had they returned earlier than planned? Or had they hired a maid during their absence, and I hadn't noticed her? However, as soon as I thought about it, the light in the window went out. At that moment, I didn't think much of it and, driven by the desire to get into my warm bed as soon as possible, headed home. In the morning, remembering the incident from the previous night, I decided to glance out the window to check if the neighbor's car was in the yard. To my surprise, their gray Ford was not there, which reinforced my theory about the maid. I decided not to investigate further and went to work, planning to call on them in the evening to make sure everything was okay. The day passed almost unnoticed, and closer to 9 in the evening, I was finally able to free myself. Passing by the windows of the building, I again saw the light in the neighbor's window, but this time there was no one inside. Then I noticed something else on the reverse side of the window. There were very strange, barely noticeable marks that looked more like palm prints, but much longer. This alarmed me slightly, and I finally decided to ring the doorbell of Lydia's apartment. Being a complete skeptic, this didn't scare me, as surely there must be a logical explanation for what was happening. I entered the entrance, went up to the first floor, and rang the doorbell of the neighboring apartment. I waited for about 2 minutes, but no one came. I rang again, same result. So, the maid must be taking a shower and couldn't hear the doorbell. After futile attempts, I turned back to go home, planning to try calling them again tomorrow to reach whoever was inside. The next day, after working my usual hours, I returned home, approached the window, and just like before, the light was on, but there was no one inside. Their gray Ford was still absent from the yard. All of this seemed very strange to me, and I decided to ring the doorbell of the neighbor's apartment again. At first, nothing happened, but on the 4th attempt, something strange occurred. There were quiet sounds from behind the door, resembling the rustling of a paper bag, and soft breathing. I exclaimed, "Is anyone there?" Answer, but in response, I heard the same sounds as if they were getting closer to the door. When the sound was right by the door, it suddenly fell silent, and nothing more could be heard. At that moment, I felt somewhat uneasy, and a wave of fear ran down my spine. It felt as though someone or something had looked through a peephole directly at me and was staring. It was a very strange feeling that I couldn't explain rationally. Eventually, I began to feel uncomfortable and went back to my place. The oppressive suspense affected me in a very strange way, for the first time in my life. The following morning, I was tormented by various thoughts. I was already thinking of calling the police. Perhaps an uninvited intruder had broken into my neighbor's apartment, who should be arrested for such audacious behavior, or maybe for illegally living in someone else's apartment. But why on earth? Lydia and her husband seemed not to be a wealthy family. Their house was comfortable but quite ordinary. I hadn't heard anything about family heirlooms in their apartment, and if they did have any, why would they need them? I decided to temporarily interrupt these strange thoughts, quickly had breakfast, and left for work. There was no time to think about it. That evening, I planned to check the apartment one last time, and if nothing changed, then I would need to call the cops, let them figure it out. Unfortunately, on that day, a workload pushed my release time back by a whole hour, so I didn't leave the building until early 11 o'clock. It was already dark, and I quickly headed home for another planned check of the apartment. I forgot to mention the apartment of Lydia was close to the corner of the building, and the window in her living room faced exactly towards that corner, thereby completing the house. And during the time when I saw the light in the kitchen, this window had been dark from the moment the owners left. Overall, peering into the windows of the house, I didn't notice anything significant except that the black cat was playing with a fly, which made me laugh. When I approached the kitchen window, I became puzzled this time. I did not see any light, and it seemed as though the apartment had been vacant the entire time, with no one wandering through. At this point, I became confused and didn't know what to do, whether to call the cops or not. It